Overcoming by Pure Voice Girl. Chapter 43. For the first time in a very long time, Will thought he might be falling ill. He woke nauseous and still a bit shaky, bleary-eyed as if he'd had too much wine to drink the night before. His bed was empty, no sign of Winston anywhere, and the light through the window spoke of it being much later than he'd first thought. Jimmy came in with Winston trotting at his heels, and he promptly moved to get Will's dressing gown. There was already a fire burning in the fireplace, and despite his usual refusal to be coddled, Will was grateful for it. There was a chill he couldn't seem to shake, and he was reluctant to leave the meager warmth of his bed to start his day. "Good morning, my lord," Jimmy said, bundling Will up in the dressing gown the moment he rose. A pair of bedroom slippers hitherto unworn met Will's toes as he gained his feet, surprising but too pleasant to protest. "Winston was very anxious to do his business when I came in to check on you, so I had one of the boys take him for a run down to the village. He's already at his breakfast as well."
"Heavens, I slept so late,"
Will breathed, rubbing the remnants of a headache away from his temple.
"You should have roused me, Jimmy."
"There's no harm getting some rest for a change, my lord," Jimmy said, tying his dressing gown snugly at the waist. "The work isn't going anywhere, and the house is in chaos getting things ready." Will winced, still dreading the gathering to come, entirely unprepared to see his father again after all of those years.
"When did you get back last night?"
he asked, curious and wishing to change the subject. "Late," Jimmy said, moving swiftly to the hallway to fetch a rolling cart. "You were tucked up in bed when I checked on you, safe and sound. You must be more careful about locking your suite, however, my lord."
"Mina doesn't have a key. She was here with me last night,"
Will said, vaguely recalling the book she'd read to him.
"I was more tired than I realized. I don't even recall falling asleep. Did you have any trouble in Chesterton?"
"Not a bit," Jimmy said, beaming at him. "Everything went flawlessly. The constables in Chesterton were more than happy to take custody of Hobbs with no questions asked. The likeness on those posters was simply uncanny."
"And was he stable?"
Will asked, knowing Hobbs had lost quite a lot of blood. "Stable enough to put up a fuss," Jimmy said, getting things situated. "But he couldn't do much in his state. The doctor there said he'd live long enough to drop on the scaffold. More's the pity the family of those girls can't have him."
"I imagine not even that could ease their pain,"
Will mused, idly stroking Winston's head, struggling to wake up.
"Has there been any word from Chelsea House?"
"No, but all things considered, we're more likely to get Lord Clarges in return rather than a letter," Jimmy said, setting out a small but luxurious brunch on the little tea table near the window. It was the same table where Will and Hannibal had taken breakfast the morning they'd left Hertford House for Marsham Heath. Will took his seat with the ghostly memory of Hannibal seated across from him, his beautiful face turned to the window as he purred.
"I have caused you quite enough pain, Will."
If only he'd spoken then of the addendum he'd signed the very day before! If only Will's knowledge of its existence would cease trying to taint his memories with "what if." "I'm curious to see what the papers will say of it," Jimmy said, lifting the lid from the tray. "We've been getting them the same day recently. That railway made the capital feel so close. It's just amazing to think how quickly information can travel these days." The scent of ham and eggs hit Will's nose like a punch to his unsettled stomach, and he jerked backwards, hand flying to cover his face. "Good gods!" Jimmy gasped, instantly putting the tray lid back on and hurrying to the washroom. He returned in seconds with a cloth and urged Will's hand down, replacing it with the cloth. Lavender oil countered the fatty scent of ham, and Will drew a deep, grateful breath, waving his hand in silent pleading for the tray to be taken away. "Gracious, my lord, I am so sorry," Jimmy said, abjectly upset that he had inadvertently caused Will distress. He put the offending tray back on the cart and rolled it out into the hallway, leaving only the tea. "Are you quite all right?"
"I believe my sister's tea disagrees with me,"
Will said, his words muffled by the cloth. He lowered it cautiously, testing the air as Jimmy cracked the window. The cool breeze chased the last of the scent away, and he drew another deep breath, his stomach calming.
"Whatever it is, I would very much appreciate it if it made no more appearances in my presence."
"His Grace dislikes it too," Jimmy said, pouring Will a glass of water to take with his tea. "Zeller has him off of everything now but honey, water, goat milk, and porridge. Perhaps I should do that for you?"
"No, thank you, Jimmy,"
Will said, closing his eyes as the air rushed over him, easing the fine sweat on his brow.
"Just some toast, perhaps. And please be sure to tell Mrs. Pims this is no criticism of her cooking, which is always excellent. I'm just feeling a little unwell this morning."
"I'll be sure she knows, my lord," Jimmy said, pulling the window closed again, lest Will become too cold. "I'll return shortly, and I am so sorry. I should have known not to bring you such strong-smelling food."
"It's never bothered me before,"
Will said, offering him a small, bewildered smile.
"There is no hurry, Jimmy. If the paper has come, please bring it as well."
"Certainly, my lord," Jimmy said, and bustled off to get Will a less dangerous breakfast. He made good use of his time in Jimmy's absence, making a quick trip to the washroom to relieve himself, still somewhat shaky and slow. Jimmy returned with a smaller tray and a bright smile, eager to see Will's comfort. The toast was much easier on him, lightly buttered as it was, and with a bountiful array of bland, fresh fruits and subtle preserves that suited him very nicely. He donned his spectacles, despite his lingering headache, and read the accompanying paper while he nibbled his toast, his nostalgia for the city surprising him. He rather missed the noise and bustle of the capital, and looked forward to returning, but Hertford House was so peaceful that he was content to merely read about the excitement happening there, rather than participate in it. The front page held a sweeping report on the Council for the Betterment of Omegas that was so scorching in its exposure of the members that Will couldn't help but smile at it. The list, lengthy and shocking, effectively unmasked the members to their families and social circles, and he imagined that no few dinner plans were being rearranged to exclude those who had attended. He scanned the names, but was none the wiser, being somewhat uninitiated still in the who's who of society. That is, until he saw his father's name near the end of the list. It sent an ugly flush of pain through him to see it there, printed in stark black and white, no less or more assuming than any other name, but more meaningful to him. Stanton Charles Graham, Earl of Reddig, was a member of the council. Jimmy, quietly clearing away the small dishes from the brunch, ventured, "Bad news, my lord?"
"No, Jimmy, just unexpected,"
Will breathed, driving the thought of his father from his mind.
"Do you recall the council I spoke to you of? The one formed to oppress Omegas?"
"I could never forget something like that," Jimmy said, settling the lid on the tray when he finished, but leaving the little teapot and cup out on the table. "Mr. Berger and I had some discussion on that count, abrupt and interrupted as it was."
"The papers were provided with a ledger from their meetings listing all of their members and the true intent. It's a scathing article, but listen,"
Will said, a slight smile on his plump lips as he read on.
"This ledger was very generously provided by the Marquess of Clarges, whose statement to this publication was adamantly in protest of this council and every core belief listed in said ledger."
"His lordship did that?" Jimmy said, uttering a soft, surprised laugh. "That is wonderful! Heavens! He doesn't waste any time, does he?"
"He certainly doesn't,"
Will said, reaching for his bond without thinking, an automatic grasp for warmth he knew awaited him. It rose at his touch, driving back the lethargic weakness that weighed his limbs, like welcome sunshine on skin.
"And Hobbs is in custody in the capital already. Magistrate Crawford confirmed his identity to the High Court. A ruling is expected this evening."
"That is a huge relief," Jimmy said, depositing the tray in the hallway.
"It truly is,"
Will said, some portion of his constant anxiety lifting with the knowledge that at least one threat was thoroughly vanquished.
"Before very much longer, Abigail will be allowed out of custody and be free to live her life. I really must get in touch with the Fosters on her behalf."
"Looks as if his capture has provoked more interest in Miss Hobbs," Jimmy said, pointing to the back of the paper. Will promptly turned it, finding the society column filled with concern for Abigail, the lamentations of mothers bemoaning the injustice heaped upon her youthful head, the regrets of fathers who rebuked Hobbs for causing such turmoil in his daughter's life.
"Little girl lost,"
he murmured, smiling to think of Henry passionately defending Abigail's innocence on his behalf, moved by the truth of her plight.
"How public opinion has changed, and for the better."
Nowhere in the column was there any indication that society had remarked the arrival of Alana Bloom to Chelsea House, or found anything at all odd about the woman staying there in Will's absence. Whatever Hannibal had done, he'd certainly done a thorough job of it. He turned back to the column about the council, reading it again and smiling, wishing he'd been there to support his husband and bear witness to his righteous temper. Dr. Sutcliffe's visit went swimmingly, and Morgan was thriving, small as he was. Miss Shell assigned herself to the case personally, and the missus had round-the-clock assistance, both from the Capital Midwives' Society, as well as from the protection agency Hannibal had hired from. He spent the late morning attending to some business and tidying up in preparation for his return home, pleased that he would make it back with time to spare before grandfather's guests were to arrive. "Letter for you, my lord."
"Thank you, Black,"
Hannibal said, plucking it from the offered tray. He frowned when he saw that it was from the Ministry of War, and his fingers trembled slightly as he slit the envelopes open.
"Lord Clarges, it is with heavy regret that I write to inform you that the space you requested on our freighters is no longer available. It is simply not feasible for the Ministry to allocate so much cargo space to your private shipments when we must use all available space in support of your soldiers on the front. Please accept our deepest apologies and know that we will do everything in our power to accommodate you in your future requests. Sincerely, Timothy Sinclair, Earl of Rathmore, Ministry, Seat 7.
"That rotten little bastard," Hannibal snarled, garnering nothing more than a raised eyebrow from Mr. Black.
"Fetch my things, Black. I'm going out." "Will you be needing a coach or your horse, my lord?"
"The horse, please," Hannibal answered, annoyed at even the thought of taking the coach out in the afternoon traffic.
"If anyone asks, I'm heading to the Ministry of War."
"I will relay that to any interested party who should know it, my lord," Mr. Black said, and Hannibal knew that there were very few people Mr. Black considered important enough to warrant telling, which suited him just fine. In under 10 minutes, Hannibal was clear of Chelsea House and on his way, weaving through the foot traffic, carriages, and coaches that thronged the roads of the capital. His outrage grew with every moment because he knew without a shadow of a doubt what had prompted this sudden reversal of the ministry. Clark Ingram and his band of exposed cowards, naturally. The Ministry of War rose opposite the courts, the ideals of destruction and justice so intertwined that even a road was not able to separate them fully. Hannibal tied his horse to a ring out front and flung a coin at a lingering little urchin, telling him,
"If he's here when I get back, there's 3 more just like it."
"Aye, my lord!" The halls echoed with the rap of his footsteps, fast and firm on the marble. People moved about their work, only a rare glance trained his direction as he took the sweeping stairs to the 2nd floor. It took little effort to locate Rathmore's office, and even less effort to startle his secretary into confirming that Rathmore was in.
"Tell him Lord Clarges is here to see him,"
Hannibal barked, stripping his gloves off with a fury as he paced, impatient and agitated. The secretary vanished, emerging a scant moment later to squeak, "Lord Rathmore will see you, my lord."
"Thank you,"
Hannibal growled, stalking past them to encounter Rathmore lounging behind his desk, looking about as hard-working as a napping cat.
"Lord Clarges,"
he said, sliding to his feet to extend his hand, which Hannibal did not take. His smile slipped sideways, more of a pained scowl, but he dropped his hand without remarking it.
"I usually insist on appointments, but I will make an exception for family."
"In appointments?" Hannibal asked, nose wrinkling in a slight snarl.
"But not for freight."
"Ah," Timothy said, as if he hadn't known the reason for Hannibal's arrival until now. He crossed his arms behind his back, attempting to puff his chest out, but Hannibal towered over him in more ways than one, no matter his posturing.
"I understand that you wish to ship supplies to our troops, but alas, I could only appropriate that much cargo space for an active duty officer. I had hoped the letter was self-explanatory."
"The letter was self-explanatory," Hannibal confirmed, tapping his hat against his thigh. "Your decision, however, smells of corruption, Lord Rathmore."
"Corruption?"
Timothy echoed, one brow hiking over his eye.
"You say that to me in the same breath as asking me to grant you freight space due to our family connection?"
"I asked you to grant me space due to my veteran status. Space for medical supplies and other necessities for the hospitals on the continent, as per the manifest I submitted through my solicitor."
"Ah, yes, the medical supplies,"
Timothy mused, smoothing his hair with his fingertips.
"I believe there was some concern regarding the unidentified necessities that took up the better half of your shipping weight. That and the fact that the crates were addressed to an individual rather than the chief medical officer."
"As the former chief medical officer," Hannibal bit out, "I am not required to provide proof of what I ship or explanations regarding to whom I ship.
I did so as a courtesy." "Perhaps not, but the general fear after your little show last night is that you're supplying illegally deployed Omegas, substances which will enable them to continue to defraud the Ministry." "Defraud?" "Now see here! I am sorry, Lord Clarges, but the matter is out of my hands. If you are not in the war, you are not given priority, and that is the end of the matter as far as the Crown sees the things,"
Timothy said, making no secret of his enjoyment.
"I would encourage you to seek alternative methods of shipment, but in times of conflict we have control of all freighters, both commercial and private. How very unfortunate for you."
"No, not for me," Hannibal said, drawing up with stiff offense. "For the soldiers you would deny medical supplies, Lord Rathmore, but never me."
"As you know, the Ministry of War has vetoed additional funding for luxury items,"
Timothy said, relishing every word.
"And if you are not on active duty, then anything you wish to send would be counted as a luxury item. And we both know there's no room in the war for luxury, don't we, Lord Clarges?"
"I wouldn't know. You certainly wouldn't," Hannibal said, incensed. Faces flashed through his mind, imploring eyes, dirty cheeks, pain-tightened mouths, gaping wounds, and ragged cries. How many were Omegas? How many had only just joined the war effort and now faced a lifetime in prison, at best, for their dedication to their country, if they could not get their needed items? And then he thought of Will, who would do anything in his power to help, whatever the cost, who had flung himself at a crazed Alpha in order to protect the daughter Louise Hobbs had died shielding. Will, his Omegan spouse, who was the only one in the world who could understand what this meant to him. A desperate bid to help those whom he had unwittingly sentenced to pain and suffering in his ignorance. He had a chance now to make up for it, a chance to help, to clear up these issues from inside and carve out a tiny crevice of almost safety for those who were most vulnerable. A chance to put the teacup back together. As if one could be mended, so too could another. Hannibal glowered at the pitiful excuse for a man before him, already revisiting his backup plan. He had been hopeful to get at least one shipment out before being discovered, buying time to make arrangements on the continent, but that would not be the case, it would seem.
"You have made some very well-placed people very unhappy, Lord Clarges,"
Timothy said, taking Hannibal's silence as encouragement. He cocked his head in mock sympathy and added,
"'Tis truly a pity."
"They will not be well placed for much longer if I can help it," Hannibal said, tugging his gloves back on. "Nor will you."
"Surely you wouldn't hold a grudge against your own family?"
Timothy inquired, not sounding a quarter as concerned as Hannibal thought he should.
"If I have no qualms exposing my father-in-law to society as a member of that blasted council,"
Hannibal said, pinning Timothy with his fiery amber eyes,
"then you stand very little chance of being shown mercy, Rathmore. My mate's tenderness for his sister makes her tolerable. That tolerance does not extend to you."
Timothy blinked, his mouth tightening, lids falling to conceal the calculation in his eyes.
"My solicitor informs me there have been lines of inquiry into my business dealings,"
Timothy said, seating himself behind his desk again and pulling a stack of papers before him.
"I would be very careful, were you, Lord Clarges. Of the two of us, only one is endowed with the power to send a man to war,
Hannibal's nose wrinkled again, his alpha fangs flashing in a brief, unhappy snarl of displeasure, the tip of his tongue touching the curve of his lower lip in fleeting contact before he purred.
"Enjoy that power while it lasts, Rathmore. You're not nearly as clever as you imagine you are, and I, for one, am going to enjoy watching you squirm in a fire of your own making." "As I said, Lord Clarges, you can always regain your freight allocation by purchasing another commission and rejoining the war effort,"
Timothy suggested, steepling his fingers beneath his jaw, his gaze as sharp as his smile.
"But I, for one, would much rather squirm in a fire of my own making than stand in a hail of bullets. Wouldn't you?"
Hannibal tipped his chin up, glaring down his nose at Timothy, and left the office in a boiling temper. He had calmed considerably by the time he reached Mr. Buttish's office, eager to settle his business and catch the earliest train back toward Hartford. He apparently was not calm enough, however, as the first thing Mr. Buttish said upon seeing him was, "Has something gone awry, my lord?"
"Yes, my disposition suffers terribly when I am separated from my husband,"
Hannibal snapped, accepting the tea the office maid brought him.
The Ministry of War has blocked my bid to ship supplies to our troops, ostensibly for lack of room, but there is very little doubt this is backlash from the Council.
I have already been exploring options on the continent at your husband's instructions, Mr. Buddish said, moving to his files and plucking several envelopes out. There is a manufacturer there I've sent an inquiry to, but it will take some time to get a reply.
Time is what we do not have, but we will do our best,
Hannibal said, restless and unhappy. He plucked up Mr. Buddish's bedraggled pencil and jotted down the address he had for Captain Rogers, saying,
"This is my contact on the front. Write to him, try to arrange an exchange point. Perhaps he can reach the suppliers on our behalf and negotiate an arrangement.
I will do so, and continue my efforts as well, my lord. Between us we will find a way to get those supplies in," Mr. Buddish said, looking only a little hollow around the eyes for what was no doubt a late night. "Miss Hobbs's emancipation has cleared the courts. A request for a legal name change has been submitted. The Fosters have been writing to her in our care. I am, of course, not allowed to deliver them, but the Lord Chancellor has been holding them on her behalf, and will deliver them to her once the case is settled."
"It is some very good news,"
Hannibal said, grateful to have some, at least.
"Did you gather the information I requested?"
"I did, my lord," Mr. Buddish confirmed, delving into another folder. "I have all the quarterly reports of your various estates, the entitlements, distributions, and nothing out of the ordinary in the least."
"Good,"
Hannibal said, sipping his tea to gather his thoughts.
"And what entitlements are available for my spouse?"
"Omegas are not considered male by law, no matter their choice and upbringing, so they cannot inherit as an alpha or beta male can," Mr. Buddish said, sounding less than pleased by it. "He is, sadly, no more included in the matter of estate than any spouse you might take."
"May I create entitlements for him?"
Hannibal asked, wishing his forefathers had not been so damnably certain their spouses were set to fleece them.
"Surely the strictures on inheritance from my mother's side are less severe?"
Mr. Buddish checked his documents and shook his head, saying, "Because he is not related by blood to you, there would be no possible way. I am sorry. As your spouse, should you precede him in death, he will live on the largesse of your male heir. You are within your rights, however, to make amendments to his Grace's will, which has generously provided for your spouse."
"And what provisions are those?"
Hannibal asked, knowing little outside of the fact that his grandfather had said will was taken care of. Again there was a brush of papers and some searching before Mr. Buddish said, "His Grace amended a previous entitlement set by his own hand that Marsham Heath would be bequeathed to William Graham at the time of his Grace's death, along with all profits made the year previous to his death, while any outstanding deficiencies would be settled from his own private coffers. He also has a set trust, my lord, of some 100,000 to be paid out in per annum sums for the care and upbringing of William Graham's children by you, Lord Clarges, and for the comfort of your spouse. He is, in all, very nicely set on. I see no deficit that you may fix." Hannibal nodded, feeling vastly ashamed of himself that his grandfather had taken such measures under the assumption that Hannibal himself would toss Will out of Hertford House like a mongrel dog the moment grandfather passed away. He looked out of the window, past the sooty glass and crowded buildings, past everything into the depths of his own memory to find Will as he had last seen him, pale and shaken in the foyer, his own brave and determined little soldier holding the fort at Hertford. "He will be, naturally, entitled to the dower house in Hertford Town when your heir marries," Mr. Buddish went on, professional in the face of Hannibal's subtle distress. "And, of course, there was nothing forbidding you from transferring any portion of your personal income into an account for him. So, following your previous instructions, I included him on all counts I was able. These are the amendments I've added to your will, including your portion of the inheritance from his Grace." Hannibal scanned the document, memorized almost word for word at this point, but read the additions with care, pleased with what he saw. He initialed and signed in the margins before annotating the bottom of the page.
"I should like copies,"
he said, nodding when Mr. Buddish indicated a second folder at hand.
"Thank you, Mr. Buddish."
"Naturally. It's my pleasure to assist you, Lord Clarges," Mr. Buddish said, solemn. "It is a relatively simple matter to divert the interest from your sown-in entitlements to your spouse's trust. On the matter of Hertford House," he delved into his paperwork yet again, and withdrew another document, reading it quickly to be certain he had the correct one. "You requested papers drawn up to state that under any circumstances Hertford House is to belong to your husband without stipulation or restriction," he said, referencing their conversation on that count. Naturally, as Hertford is, in essence, his Grace's until his death, settles it on your husband. There was no legal standing for you to do so. However, this document states that in the event that you inherit Hertford House, which, according to his Grace's addendum, will be official upon the birth of your first child, you wish possession of Hertford to be given to your husband. Effectively, you abdicate any claim to Hertford House, and it will be solely the property of your spouse, Will Graham, to be settled as he sees fit. He handed the paper to Hannibal and said, I must ask, my lord, if you are quite sure of what you've asked. This gives legally binding ownership of your ancestral home to your husband. There can be no addendum to such a finalized contract. While I would never dare question the depth of your attachment, I do know that his Grace will have his own concerns regarding your decision, and will no doubt raise them before he sees fit to sign this paper. Hannibal's brows knit together in a frown as he read it, but only said, I will convince him, have no doubts on that count. I will deliver this to him personally and see that both he and my husband sign it. I've put off admitting to the existence of that damned addendum long enough. Hopefully this will undo any damage my admission may yet do. I wish you the very best of luck with that, my lord, Mr. Buddish said, tidying the papers and getting Hannibal's copies neatly bound for travel. When that is returned to us, we will send a copy back to Mr. Stamets. Considering the loss of the previous document, I believe I shall deliver it personally. That might be for the best, Mr. Buddish, Hannibal said, breathing a little easier to know he was just that much closer to having everything settled and being able to return home to Will. Will returned to his suite later that day, feeling rather accomplished. The guest suites were cleaned, aired, and prepared for their guests. The larders were groaning with prepared foods, and extra staff were accommodated in the servants' quarters. Mr. Landry was hired as the new estate manager, and the new guards Hannibal had sent from the capital were circling the house like vultures in his absence, but were otherwise very nicely settled in. He was surprisingly tired for doing so little, and returned to his room hoping to rest before dinner in the tranquil, soothing quiet. He did not expect to arrive in the midst of controlled chaos, and slowed his pace as he approached his suite, staring in bewilderment at the stacks of brand-new travel trunks the house footmen were shifting into his suite. Winston dashed into the thick of it, tail wagging and tongue lolling, excited to have a chance to embroil himself in action. Will hurried after him, staring in surprise at the open trunks littering the entryway to his suite, a flurry of unfamiliar Omegas and Beta women swiftly whisking items of clothing out and into his dressing room. He followed them within, eyes widening with shock to see the cavernous space rapidly filling with every imaginable item he could ever possibly dream of, and directing everyone with the sure confidence of a general on the battlefield, was the same Omega from the fashion house, with Jimmy in close attendance.
What on earth is going on here?
Will asked, stepping aside as more clothing was borne in and hung with military precision. Oh, my lord, pardon the mess, Jimmy said, all smiles as he gestured around them. You've had a delivery from the capital. Will shook his head, brow wrinkling in confusion, but all he could manage was,
Are you sure there hasn't been a mistake?
There is no mistake, my lord, Nichola said, elegantly beautiful as always, their luxurious Omegan clothing exchanged for more travel-friendly garb, but still exquisite. It is a commission, my lord, from your husband.
Nichola,
Will said, the name slipping to the front of his memory.
I did not expect to see you here.
I do apologize for arriving unannounced, but Lord Clarges was most insistent everything be delivered as whole as soon as possible, Nicholas said, stepping aside for Will to move closer to his new wardrobe. My lord, have no worry at all, and forgive the mess, Jimmy said, almost as excited as Winston was. We'll have everything put up properly in no time. Will nodded absently, saying with a touch of reproach,
I seem to recognize no few of these items.
I'm afraid I indulged in a little subterfuge, my lord, Nichola admitted, their smile small but devilish. We required a final fitting that you were so kind as to indulge me. I fear I took advantage of your good nature. But in my defense, I did say the items were made for you. Flustered, Will laughed softly and shook his head.
It is a mistake. I did not take you literally.
An entire trunk of fine foundation garments, stockings, and garters were open before him, and Will stared, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the wardrobe Hannibal had ordered him. He drifted through the dressing-room, which no longer looked overlarge and empty, not with so many people hanging and arranging the garments that had arrived. Even as he watched, dozens of pairs of shoes were unpacked and shelved, glittering buckled shoes, soft slippers, sturdy day boots, riding boots, hat after fashionable hat to match the various riding habits that had appeared, among other traditionally female items, all sorted for Jimmy's convenience under Nicola's advice. It was a fortune in clothing. It absolutely had to be. Just the quality of the cloth was a fortune on its own, never mind the expertise of the craftsmanship involved in tailoring the pieces. Adding in the accessories, Hannibal had gone entirely overboard on. This was worth Will's dowry at least, with more on the way every moment. Will reached out and ran his fingers down the pearlescent brocade of an Omegan-style jacket hanging close by, almost a replica of the one he'd worn to the masquerade, and he knew there was no coincidence involved in that. He found himself smiling as he rubbed the material between his fingertips, lost for a moment in the echoes of a waltz and the memories of that night. "Oh, this is perfect!" Jimmy declared, drawing Will's attention. He held before him a lace and silk undergarment in deep, rich blue, so dark it was almost black, and Nichola held up the matching wrapper, a pair of bedroom slippers in their other hand. "Surely he didn't order that?" Will asked, moving toward it on impulse, unable to resist feeling the softness of the silk. "Oh, indeed, my lord," Nichola said, handing the wrapper off to Jimmy, who held it out to inspect it. They delved into the trunk and rose with several more, all in various colors, emerald, pale amethyst, and deep ruby. "He ordered 2 of each, with standing orders for the new colors as they arrive. I find these so stunning with your skin tone, but the fine pastels will be just as flattering when they arrive, my lord." "When?" Will valiantly fought the heat he knew was filling his cheeks, and both Jimmy and Nichola, professionals that they were, very politely pretended not to notice. "Oh, yes," Nichola said, absolutely serious. They handed more of the garments off to Jimmy, who busily inspected them to familiarize himself. "He left standing orders for the latest fashions from the continent, which I will happily escort to fit you for, and do any adjustments you may need, though my measurements are rather more precise than Mr. Avery's." "These are all the rage on the continent, my lord," Jimmy insisted, inspecting the lower area with curiosity, and making a satisfied little "aha" of discovery when he saw the construction. Will cleared his throat and dropped his hand, clasping his wrist behind his back for good measure. It was honestly overwhelming, too much to take in, but he smiled as he scanned the room, any thoughts of umbrage rapidly wilting beneath the warm pleasure of the joy Hannibal took in him. He imagined his husband in the fashion house, ordering items, perhaps thinking of how Will would look wearing them. He was so picky, Will knew, that he must have rejected so many things on some preference or another, or asked for a desired pattern to be made in a color which suited Will better. He'd spent hours agonizing over a seafoam waistcoat versus a royal blue one, after all. It was easy to think this would have taken half a lifetime. "Were you the one who assisted him personally, Nichola?" Will asked, his fingers brushing over a stack of sensible corsets, which would no doubt still manage to test Hannibal's discipline despite their benign appearance, much like Will's knees. "I did, my lord, and very happily too," Nichola said, making a gesture at one of the assistants that sent a box of gloves to a different shelf, where another assistant unpacked them. "I am trying to imagine him ordering these things," Will murmured, his eyes landing on the delicate undergarments again, folded neatly and awaiting final placement. "Especially those." "Oh, he took some coaxing on those, my lord," Nichola confided, lovingly smoothing the folded material where a wrinkle had dared mar the surface. "He was insistent that you were already a menace to his rational thought, and that he feared he might expire should he see you in such a thing." Will's cheeks bloomed with vivid color, but his smile widened to a grin, his small Omegan fangs bared in pleasure. "And then he ordered 2 of all of them," Nicholas said with satisfaction, thoroughly pleased. "Apparently his lordship feels the reward is worth the risk in this case." "He must be very confident he will survive the coshing I'm going to give him," Will whispered, eyes tracing every item all over again, too delighted to be annoyed with his husband making good on the promise of 3 wardrobes to please him. "I must go fishing at once." "I believe the catch you currently have is quite a good one, my lord," Nichola said, smiling when Will chuckled. "May I ask you a favor, Nichola?"
I have an event coming up, a dinner party. It's the first we've hosted since my marriage. Might you recommend something tasteful I could wear? As I said, I've no head for fashion, and you are always so beautifully turned out."
"My lord, you flatter me," Nichola said, embarrassed but pleased, one hand pressed to their cheek in a brief moment of indulgence. "I will put together some options with Mr. Price for you to choose from, if you would like."
"I would be very grateful, Nichola. You are very kind to do so."
There was a small addition to the commotion, and Will heard Mina's voice raised in inquiry. She followed the same trail Will had, puzzled, her blue eyes widening with every step until they showed whites all around with her shock.
"Will? What on earth is all this?"
Will looked around once more with a wide, satisfied smile before telling her,
"The desperate act of a man who very badly wishes to be rid of me."
When Hannibal returned to Chelsea House, Mr. Berger reported that the deliveries from Gideon and Garnet's had arrived. He eagerly opened the elaborate box containing the teacup and took a peek, not daring to lift it from its velveteen bed. The porcelain was laced with gold, the shards and pieces drawn together with the precious metal by a painstaking artist. There were places where the pieces had been lost, shattered too finely to be replaced. They had been filled in solidly with gold, silent testament to the tragedy that had befallen it. The precious metal veined the fragile teacup's surface in a painful reminder to him that some things would always remain lost to regret, the whisper of what might have been a barb in his very soul.
"My lord?"
Berger ventured, noting the tears that misted Hannibal's eyes as he gazed at it.
"Is it not to your liking?"
"It's perfect, Berger," Hannibal whispered, tracing the lines with care for their delicacy.
"The other set I ordered, did it come as well?"
"Packed and ready, my lord," Berger confirmed, relieved that he wasn't unhappy. "Along with the lure-making set and the other gifts you commissioned. Mrs. Garnet sent along a strong box of jewelry as well."
"Wonderful,"
Hannibal said, pleased. He closed the box up securely, but stayed Berger when he reached for it, saying,
"I will carry this with me, Berger. Thank you."
"Yes, my lord. We're ready to go any time as you are."
"Go ahead. Send the trunks onto the railway, Berger. I'll be along shortly."
With everything settled as much as he possibly could settle them, and with the Missis's little family in good hands, Hannibal packed the paperwork from Mr. Buddish into his valise and went to say his goodbyes. It felt strangely final, but in a good way, as if closing the book firmly on the past 6 years of his life in order to open a fresh one for his future. Alana, Margot, and Marissa were content. Morgan was well cared for, and they were all looking forward to their family visit as he looked forward to his own. He admonished them to contact Mr. Buddish with any need they might have, and to rely on the Chelsea House staff to take care of them. And then he gathered his things to make the evening train to Chesterton. It was a relief for Will to return to his suite after supper. It had been a long, exhausting, but overall productive day, and he found himself more tired than usual. There had been no word from Hannibal, which he hoped meant his husband himself was on his way, rather than intentionally not informing him. Jimmy was busy in the washroom drawing Will a bath, and so Will did not trouble him. He let himself into his well-stocked dressing room and undressed, exchanging his formal dinner clothes for his new bathing slippers and the warm, lined robe Hannibal had ordered for him. Much to his mingled annoyance and amusement, his initials were monogrammed into the collar, as if someone else might mistake it for theirs, and it coaxed a weary laugh from him just to think of his husband asking for such a thing, no doubt preening with delight as he did so.
"I really will have to cosh him,"
Will sighed, casting an odd, delighted glance over the contents of his dressing room again. Had Hannibal attempted such a high-handed action in the early days of his return, Will would have been outraged, knowing he'd done so for his own selfish reasons. Now, however, gazing at the bounty around him, Will only felt vast affection and tenderness swelling inside of him, knowing that Hannibal had taken his own time to personally choose everything here, not from a desire to buy his complacency or impress society, but simply because he loved Will and wanted to do something unexpected for him. Will truly wanted to do something unexpected for Hannibal in return, and he silently returned to the washroom, still considering how he might manage such a thing. "Nearly ready, my lord," Jimmy said as he wandered in, leaving Winston stretched out on the carpet next to his bed. Will watched Jimmy set out sheets and washcloths before adding some oil to the water. The scents of lavender and chamomile teased Will's nose, and he drew a deep breath, letting it soothe him. He'd finally gotten over the strange illness that Mina's tea had caused him, and he was resolved he would drink no more of it, not if it left him feeling so sick.
"Jimmy, is the artist who painted grandfather's portrait last year still in Hartford?"
he asked, slipping his feet out of his little shoes, toes curling on the cold tiled floor. "As far as I know, my lord," Jimmy answered, moving to take Will's robe as he shrugged it off. He hung it on the ornamental hook next to the massive tub, and reached out to steady Will as if he might suddenly take a tumble.
"Could you arrange a meeting with him for me? Here, at Hartford House?"
Will requested, accepting Jimmy's steadying hand as he slipped into the scented, hot water to his shoulders.
"And ask him if he could bring whatever supplies he might need for a sketch."
"Are you wanting to commission a portrait?" Jimmy asked, eyes lighting up with glee. Will nodded, sighing as he relaxed into the water.
"A miniature. Something that might fit into a pocket watch casing, or perhaps a locket."
"I will ask him if he does miniatures, my lord," Jimmy said, sliding the soaps and washcloths into easy reach from the bathing table. He pulled the bathing stool to the head of the tub and positioned it, asking, "Would you like your hair washed?"
"I'll see to it myself, Jimmy. You needn't trouble yourself,"
Will said, a little mystified as to why the staff were so concerned with his comfort. Not that they had ever been anything but, only that Will's persistence in resisting it had made them more circumspect in their offerings.
"Could you put some of that oil on a cloth for me? I rode the rounds with Mr. Landry, and all I can smell is pig manure and spoiled milk. Feel as if I could choke."
"Of course, my lord," Jimmy said, dipping a cloth in the hot water and pouring a judicious amount of oil onto it. He rubbed it in and handed it to Will, who draped it over his nose and mouth with a happy sigh, settling back with his eyes closed to rest in the steaming water. The door to Hannibal's suite cracked open, and Jimmy looked up in surprise, holding his tongue, when Lord Clarges himself pressed a finger to his lips, his golden eyes bright with delight. Jimmy silently moved back into Will's suite, closing the door behind him without a sound, as Hannibal eased into the washroom, a little bedraggled from traveling, but too eager to see his husband to wait. Hannibal closed the door with a soft click, and paused there, greedily taking in the sight of his mates submersed in the bath. Will looked small and delicate in the massive tub, his lithe white limbs mere smudges of color beneath the infused cloudy water. With the cloth over his face and his eyes closed, he had no idea Hannibal was anywhere near, and that suited him just fine. Enticed by the peaceful scene before him, Hannibal rolled back his sleeves, thanking every god he could recall that the train had only run a little behind. As much as he had hated arriving too late to share dinner with Will, at least he had arrived in time to catch him in the bath. He settled on the bathing stool and took up the cup, ladling hot water over Will's hair to soak it.
"You really needn't, Jimmy,"
Will protested, a sleepy murmur from beneath the wet cloth accompanied by a small furrow of his brow. Hannibal said nothing, merely poured another cup of water over Will's curls, pulling them long in the water, and slid his fingers into Will's silky hair in a gentle massage. The moment he did so, Will's exquisite blue eyes fluttered open, confusion already apparent because he recognized the touch, recognized Hannibal even with his scent blocked by the strong lavender oil. He snatched the cloth from his face, Hannibal's rich alpha scent eradicating the delicate floral oils, heavy and welcoming in Will's lungs. Hannibal's hand slid beneath his skull, needling the nape of his neck with one powerful palm, smoothing his curls with the other, and Will subsided in the water, heart pounding. He reached up with one dripping hand and touched Hannibal's smooth, high cheek, needing to confirm for himself that it was Hannibal here with him, not some painful figment of his imagination.
"Say something,"
Hannibal whispered, leaning into the touch with the same purring contentment of a cat. He turned his head to kiss Will's fingertips, still massaging his neck and scalp with cautious care.
"What would you like me to say?"
Will asked, his words a husky purr, his initial surprise fading to pleasure.
"Anything,"
Hannibal told him, his smile crooked and endearing.
"I've missed hearing the sound of your voice."
Will swallowed, wetting his lips with the tip of his tongue, blue eyes sweeping Hannibal's beautiful face over and over. There was a thread of shaky relief in his voice when he whispered,
"You came back to me."
Hannibal's sculpted features tightened in a moment of pain reflected in his words when he asked,
"Did you doubt I would?"
Will shook his head, Hannibal's hand sliding over his nape, and he smiled.
"No, I didn't doubt it, Hannibal,"
he whispered, dropping his hand from Hannibal's cheek to the rim of the tub. He pulled himself upright, grateful for the way Hannibal's hand slid down to his shoulders to help him sit up. He turned in the sloshing water, curling up against the edge of the tub, and cocked his head as he gazed up at his husband.
"You said you would always return to me, Hannibal. Welcome home."
"I was not home until I was with you,"
Hannibal insisted, cupping Will's throat where the mark he'd laid had healed to a stark, vivid scar. He traced it tenderly, his touch reverent. The force of the love he held for his mate almost overcame him then, and his amber eyes sparkled as he murmured,
"You are my home, Will. Always and forever."
"Hannibal,"
Will breathed, shifting to cup the face with both hands, only then noticing the travel dust and how unusually unkempt his husband was. A small curl of acutely Omegan pleasure unfurled within him to know how eager his husband was to return to him.
"I've spent my nights searching for the sound of your breathing next to me, reaching for the warmth of you to find only empty air,"
Hannibal purred, his lids falling to cover his amber eyes, pain tightening the bow of his mouth. His hand slipped from Will's throat to his shoulder, smoothing the water away with absent affection.
"Every moment I've spent away from you I've spent looking for you, straining to hear your voice in a crowd, searching for your remarkable curls, reaching to grasp your hand next to mine."
His words settled on Will's aching heart like a soothing balm, his relief to have his husband back dampening his anger and hurt about the addendum. He was so pleased by Hannibal's abrupt appearance before him that he had no desire to quarrel with him, not yet, not now, when he was touching Will as if every precious treasure he could imagine lay just beneath his skin.
"I've been haunted by you, Will, painfully and blissfully so. The ghost of your presence a constant reminder of the home I longed for,"
Hannibal said, his lids lifting to pin Will with their full strength of sincerity. There was no mistaking the aching swell of emotion that flowed into Will through his bond. Love, and love, and love, against all odds or caution, always rising up to vanquish anything that might seek to part them.
"I couldn't bear another moment without you. I had to lay eyes on you, to breathe your scent and touch your skin and be whole once more, as I only am with you. When I say that you are my home, Will, I truly mean it."
Will's smile softened, almost tremulous with his painfully sweet affection for the Alpha before him. He dropped his hand to Hannibal's chest, where his heart beat beneath layers of his clothing, sure and swift. His eyes swept closed when Hannibal leaned against him, forehead to forehead, breathing each other's breath and silently absorbing all the tiny details that meant they were together again. The mingling of their scents, the soft rush of their breath, the minute flicker of their eyelids, and the slight shifting of their bodies. The familiarity of it lifted a weight from them both, an oppressive sense of being slightly out of step, as if the world had tilted just a fraction sideways and no one had noticed but the two of them. But the world righted itself as their lips met in a gentle, careful kiss. It was the softest of touches, a light and reverent brush of mouths that quickly deepened. Will shifted his touch to Hannibal's jaw, marveling at the heat of his skin, at the very fact that he was here, at the undeniable and fierce delight that flooded him from his bond, separate from his own deep regard, but no less. He opened his mouth and slid his tongue between Hannibal's fine lips, drawing a rumbling purr from his husband that made his toes curl. He uttered a soft sighing chirp of sound against Hannibal's mouth, and was rewarded with a tender but fierce insistence that left them both panting softly when they finally parted.
"I've missed you so much, Will,"
Hannibal breathed, eyes closed as they rested against one another, shivering when Will's hands moved to unknot his neckerchief, slow and studied in his movements.
"I've missed you too,"
Will said, the admission heady as the understanding that grew more certain with every moment, even if some frightened part of him held him mute when he longed to say the words aloud.
"I worried that with everything happening you might be delayed from grandfather's party."
"I would never miss it,"
Hannibal said, easing back to undo his waistcoat buttons, eyeing the steaming water of Will's bath with renewed appreciation.
"Not just because grandfather really would disown me for it. This will be our first event as a married couple. I know what that means in the eyes of society."
"Which you don't give 2 figs for, if I recall,"
Will murmured, tossing the neckerchief aside and shifting up onto his knees to undo Hannibal's shirt.
"Or was it 3?
2. Always only 2. I would hurry, were I you. I'm covered in dust and ready to soak, and Might not wait for you to finish before I begin."
"You've never had any trouble letting me finish to this point," Will said, pleased when Hannibal cocked a brow at him, impressed. He sank back into the water to settle with a sigh, eyes closing. "I'm determined to have a soak myself, Lord Clarges. You'll have to work around me." Hannibal grinned, thoroughly delighted, and made short work of shedding the rest of his clothes, piling them haphazardly on the little dressing stool, with his boots shoved down next to it. He eased into the steaming water and settled, a delighted groan escaping him as the heat penetrated his aching muscles. Will shifted to settle against him, a warm and solid weight curled up between Hannibal's spread thighs, the firm heft of his bottom resting in the cup of Hannibal's groin. Seeing the beautiful stretch of Will's shoulders and the top of his back there before him was a lure Hannibal simply couldn't resist. He plucked up the floating washcloth, wrinkling his nose a little at the clinging scents of lavender and chamomile, and soaped it thoroughly before easing Will to lean forward, folding against his dangerous knees. Hannibal smoothed Will's wet curls away from his nape, and ran the soapy cloth down his spine and back up, following the curve of his shoulder. "Hannibal," Will said, eyes closing and skin rippling in goosebumps as his husband bathed him, silent and humble. "You really needn't."
"I wish to,"
Hannibal murmured, the water sloshing as he dipped the cloth again, rinsing it before soaping it anew. He sat up behind him and slid it beneath Will's jaw, with light pressure, smoothing it down the length of his throat and over the slope of shoulders, working in and around the tuck of Will's delightful body just for the joy of touching him. Will closed his eyes, the warmth that filled him from Hannibal's touch far greater than anything his heat could ever inspire. His body gave with every brush of the cloth against skin, every inch of him lovingly soaped and rinsed in silent admiration. Another silent admiration rose against his backside, a sign of appreciation without expectation, simply the proud offering of an alpha entirely captivated by the omega he touched. And Will was equally captivated, the reflexive stir of flesh subsiding to comforting closeness as he returned the favor, washing and rinsing the miles of travel from Hannibal's yielding body, in an act equally as intimate as any carnal pursuits. There was so much to be said, but they did not speak, reluctant to disrupt the comfort of being together with ugly reality. But the water cooled, and time marched on, and Hannibal finally heaved a reluctant sigh, saying,
"As much as I wish we could stay just like this, I'm afraid I have some things to tend to before I can rest my weary head."
He squeezed Will to his chest for emphasis, inhaling the sweet, lush scent of Will's skin beneath the strong scents of lavender and chamomile. There was a richness to his familiar, sweet, hot perfume, round and ripe enough to sink his teeth into. He found himself rubbing his heavy teeth over Will's mark, hands cupping and smoothing the taut firmness of his belly without even meaning to do so. Will smiled to himself, covering Hannibal's hands with his own and murmuring, "Should we stay a little longer, then?" Hannibal purred against his throat and eased back with a reluctant sigh, brought back to task by Will's gentle reminder. He rose from the tub with a dancer's grace and reached for the bathing sheets, spreading his arms wide. Will smiled, allowing Hannibal to draw him from the tub, rosy and pink from their bath. His heart trembled anew when Hannibal began to dry him, as loving and exacting in this act as he was in all others. Hannibal simply couldn't help himself. It was a rare opportunity to lavish care and attention on his mate, and he had been so miserable without him. Every petty irritation, every gut-wrenching worry, every anxiety and upset that plagued him vanished like shadows in the presence of his solemn, perfect husband. It was a gift to be able to touch him this way, to give him even a sliver of tenderness he was due, and Hannibal would make the most of that gift for as long as Will would allow him to. He chafed Will's long limbs dry, following the sheet with soft, brushing kisses here and there, at his shoulders, at the soft nape of his neck, at the little dimples above his round, firm backside, over the pinkened skin of his knees, lingering just below the delicate indent of his navel. He slid Will's long, slender feet into his bathing slippers, and finally rose to wrap a dry sheet around him, drawing Will into the damp circle of his arms.
"Gods, how I've missed you, Will,"
Hannibal sighed, murmuring the words against Will's throat, against the mark he'd laid on Will's graceful neck.
"Mr. Black was ready to bar me from Chelsea House. I was so disagreeable."
"You usually are disagreeable," Will murmured, with a small smile, rubbing his nose against Hannibal's skin before tipping his head back. I'm just more tolerant than most.
Hannibal grinned, his sharp alpha fangs bright and dangerous and impressive.
Yes, you certainly are. And I must beg you to be more tolerant in the coming days, Will, and withhold from cautioning me, if you can.
Is there some particular insistence you fear I might have to caution you for?
Will asked, innocently enough that it put Hannibal on his guard.
Only my particular delight in your method of settling matters with violence,
Hannibal admitted. He gazed down at Will with alpha satisfaction brimming in his amber eyes, his arms gentle but firm around Will's body.
There is so much I have to tell you, Will.
There is so much I have to tell you,
Will said, working his hands from beneath the sheet to grasp Hannibal's bare flanks, smoothing his skin with absent appreciation.
Some of which you truly aren't going to like.
Hannibal frowned, concern filling his handsome face, but he admitted with a touch of chagrin.
Nor will you, I'm afraid. Sometimes truth is the cruelest and most difficult thing to manage with someone you love. Isn't that right?
Will smiled, shifting in the confining bathing sheet to cup Hannibal's face with both hands, feeling every fluttering emotion through his bond, and knowing how fragile his husband was in his honesty. Truth gave them the power to wound one another, and honesty could be more deadly than any sword in the wrong hands, as they both well knew.
I love you, Will,
Hannibal said, simple and direct, as raw and tender now as it had been the first time.
When everything is said and done, please remember how my love for you has changed me from the man I was, and that there is nothing in this world I would not do for you.
I could never be in doubt of that, Hannibal,
Will said. He pressed a lingering, soothing kiss to Hannibal's mouth and leaned in to embrace him, sighing with contentment when Hannibal cradled him close. His eyes swept close as unexpected tears welled behind his lids, awed by how completely and perfectly happy he felt to be once more at home in his husband's loving arms.